So hello students. So today, as you can see in the diagram there, we would be doing the structure of the human heart and about its working. So in this particular topic, we are not expected much to know about the external structure, but I think that it will be better if you yourself revise this, since you have done this topic well in the 12th class. So what you need to know is the initial part about its external morphology. Where you will be trying to find out more about its location and about its size. These features you can easily find out. And then let us quickly get into the internal structure. So there are two atria which we call as the right and left atria, and these are separated by a septa which is called as the interauricular septa, which divides the two atria. There are two ventricles, again right and left, and there is a septum in between the two which divides it. Similarly, externally, between the auricle and the ventricle, there is a clear groove. There's a clear groove between both the auricles and the ventricles. We can demarcate this groove, and in this groove is called as the coronary sulcus. And in this coronary sulcus, the large veins of the coronary veins, they come together and they form a coronary sinus. And the coronary sinus sits in this coronary groove and then empties into the right auricle. So that empties into the right auricle somewhere over here. And this is in fact guarded by a Thebesian valve. So that is the opening of the coronary sinus, which opens right into right atrium. So I'll repeat this again. Externally, between the two auricles and the two ventricles, that means between the auricle and the ventricle, we can clearly mark out a groove, and that groove is called as coronary sulcus. And in that coronary sulcus are the veins, which we call as they combine together and they form a coronary sinus. And the coronary sinus doesn't empty into the inferior and superior vena cava, but right directly into the right atrium, somewhere over here, as I marked it out. And that's actually guarded by a thin valve, a kind of a valve called as a Thebesian valve. So here let us mark out the this is the superior vena cava, and that will open up somewhere over here in this region, and this is the inferior vena cava. This is the right atrium. Now in between, internally, between the right atrium and right ventricle is what we call as the tricuspid wall, or it is called as the right AV valve. So this is the right AV valve, or we call this as the tricuspid, because it's made of three cusps, cup-shaped structures, tricuspid, three flaps, and these flaps are held together by connective tissues which are thread-like, and these we call as chordae tendineae. And these chordae tendineae are actually attached to these little mounds that are raised over here in the ventricle, which we call, these are called as papillary muscles. This particular mound-like structure over here, these are mounds which are inside the ventricles, and these are called as the papillary muscles. So over here also we have papillary muscles. Between the left atrium and left ventricle, we have the left AV valve, or the left atrioventricular valve. This is called as bicuspid, or as mitral valve. This also is held by or supported by connective tissue cords, and these are on these papillary muscles. So these are also the chordae tendineae, and these are the muscles. Similarly, between the right ventricle and pulmonary artery, between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery, there emerges, or in that place is guarded by semilunar valves. And similarly between the left ventricle and the left aorta or the great aorta, we have semilunar valves. So we can mark these. This is the pulmonary artery, which is carrying deoxygenated blood into the lungs. These are the pulmonary vein that is bringing oxygenated blood into the left atrium. This part over here, there are 3 semilunar valve. So you can call this as the pulmonary semilunar valve. Okay. Whereas this part is called as the pulmonary valve or the semilunar valve, but of the aorta. So this is called as aortic semilunar valve. So both these are guarded by semilunar valves, but the semilunar valves are, here it is aortic semilunar valve and here it is pulmonary semilunar valve. There are a bunch of 3 such structures over here which will guard it. So there is semilunar valve of the pulmonary. So pulmonary semilunar valve, and this semilunar valve is of the aorta. So this is the aortic semilunar valve. Then when we consider the entire heart itself, the heart is covered by pericardium. When there are 2 layers, as I already talked to you, there will be an outer pericardium and an inner pericardium, parietal pericardium and visceral pericardium. And that visceral pericardium is often called as epicardium. Then there is myocardium, which is made up of cardiac muscle cells, cardiomyocytes, and internally that leads into the inner part, which is called as the endocardium. And one thin layer of epithelium is there, which we call as the endothelium. And this pericardium, as I told you, there are 2 layers, and in these 2 layers there is a pericardial fluid. So also that inside the pericardium, both the nerves and blood vessels, that means coronary blood vessels, they will enter into this place. This myocardium, which we have mentioned over here, is highly compact, and therefore the blood vessels are required to supply oxygen to this. In fishes, it is spongy, and therefore blood vessel is not required to supply oxygen to the heart. But here blood vessel is required to supply blood vessel to the heart. Remember that although the heart is muscular and it is pumping blood throughout the day, throughout the life. It itself doesn't get any blood supply. Therefore, it must get it only through the coronary artery and drained out through the coronary veins. So this is important to know. So these were the important parts of the heart. Take a look once again at the different structures over here. This is the right atrium, this is the right ventricle, this is the left ventricle, this is the left atrium, this is the pulmonary artery, this is the pulmonary vein, this is the great aorta or the dorsal aorta, left aorta. These are the superior and inferior vena cava. On the right side we have a tricuspid valve, on the left side we have a bicuspid or a mitral valve. And from the left auricle is emerging out the dorsal or the left aorta, and from the right ventricle is emerging out the pulmonary artery. And you can see this entire diagram of the heart. The heart is like a triangle, and this part is called as the apex, and this part is called as the base. So this part is actually called as the apex, where we have the ventricle, whereas the base over here is where we have, at the base we have the atria. And remember that the heart is actually located in the center of the chest cavity, but its apex is pointing towards the left side, and therefore we have a feeling that it is actually placed on the left side. It's actually centrally located in between the two lungs, but it's pointing towards the left. Now the internal working. The internal working or the mechanism in which it works. For this we have to know that cardiac muscle cells or cardiomyocytes, they are interconnected. By what we call as intercalated discs. And therefore contraction of the muscle cells can spread. Contraction of these muscle cells can spread. But the beauty of the human heart is that the human heart is myogenic. That means it initiates and maintains rhythmic contractions. It can initiate and maintain rhythmic contraction. This is possible because of a partly electrical activity to these group of muscle cells, which we call as conducting tissue, which is very specialized conducting tissue. So some of these cells, they have a specialized electrical activity. The way in which they depolarize is slightly different, and therefore it gives it a special quality of initiating and maintaining the rhythmic contraction. Remember that these cells by themselves don't contract, but they can spread that depolarization. And this electrical conducting tissue is very special. So this is made up of, that conducting element is made up of some parts, some elements. The first one is called as the SAN, the sino-auricular node, which is the pacemaker. And this is located just at where the superior vena cava enters into the right atrium. At that point, this SAN is located, and this SAN conducts the tissue, conducts the electrical impulse, and gives it to the AV node, which is so this is somewhere you will get the SAN, the AVN. So it is conducting this tissue from the SAN, or the sino-atrial node, into the auriculoventricular node, and from there it gets into this part over here, which is called as the AV bundle. So the first element in this is the SAN, the sino-atrial node, or the pacemaker. Then is the AV node, which is the auriculoventricular node. Both these are in the, you can make it out its position in the right auricle or the right atrium. This also is in the right atrium. Hence, right atrium contracts first, and then the left atrium. Now this AV node then passes the conduction to the bundle in the top of the ventricular wall, interventricular valve. So this is called as the AV bundle, and this is named after a person, and therefore it is called as the AV bundle of his. Then from here a number of branches arise that go right down to the apex of the ventricle and then emerges up throughout. So this entire thing is called as the Purkinje fibers. So which spreads it to the ventricle. So this is the method in which the conducting tissue is located. From the auricle it will spread to the ventricle, and this conducting tissue spreads the waves of deep polarization, but they themselves do not contract. But they themselves do not contract. Now let us see the steps involved in the heart functioning. Firstly, you will have the atrial systole. So let's simplify this and write just that there is an atrial systole. or atrial contraction. So this has been preceded by an atrial diastole just when at the end of the ventricular systole. So at that time the blood now has already come into the atria, into both the atria. So atrial systole means the atria are going to contract, but it means that this has been preceded by atrial diastole where the blood has already come into the atria. Now both the atria contract. First the left atrium will contract, then first the right atrium will contract, then the left atrium will contract. So when they contract, at that time, because the pressure is so great, both tricuspid and mitral valves open. And once both these valves are open, because this is contracting, blood is now rushing passively into the ventricle. Blood enters ventricles passively because this is contracting. So remember that when the atria are contracting, first thing is that the right side will contract little bit first, then after a few milliseconds the left side will contract. So that is slightly out of phase. Then when this atria are contracting, at that time, because the pressure is too great, both these valves will open and the blood will enter the ventricles passively. So now at this point the ventricles were in diastole. So when this is happening, the ventricles were in diastole, and at this point both the pulmonary semilunar valve as well as the atrial semilunar valve, both of them were closed. Both of them are closed. So the blood is now entering inside and the blood has now come into the ventricle. Now it is the time for the ventricular systole. Now this is actually occurring in two phases. First there is a ventricle begins to contract, then there is a great deal of pressure, tremendous amount of pressure is there. Now when this pressure goes on increasing in the first phase itself, at that time the blood cannot go back into the atrium. So tricuspid and bicuspid valves shut. This leads to first sound, which is called as the lub sound. The first sound of the heart is called as a lub sound when it is contracting. And naturally at this time the pulmonary valves have got opened up. Both the pulmonary semilunar valve as well as the atrial semilunar valve, both of these valves have got opened up by this time. And just when the ventricle has now contracted tremendously and the blood is entered into both the pulmonary artery and to the dorsal aorta, this is followed by ventricular diastole. And when that happens, when the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves are shut, when the pressure afterwards, the pressure of this has increased tremendously, then it will come down to relaxation state. At that time this gets shut. When this gets shut, we have the second sound, which is called as the dub. So atrial systole at that time, or just before that, during just previous to that, there was ventricular diastole, and when this ventricular systole is happening, it is atrial diastole. So these are the steps which are taking place very quickly, and this would be how the heart would be working. Here you can try to find out more about what we mean by cardiac output. You can find out what is meaning by stroke volume, and you can find out what is the effect of sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves on heart rate. You can find out some of these questions to increase a little more of the knowledge regarding the working of the heart. So with that, this is Professor Ravindranath signing off. Thank you.